Ignite your curiosity with Austin Next. We're watching Austin transform from a thriving ecosystem into a global superstar. With our host, Jason Scharf, we aspire to better comprehend the true nature of innovation. Together, we will uncover what makes a successful ecosystem and navigate the technologies shaping our future. Now let's dive into what's next.
Can a meal be more than just food on a plate? Can it be a source of comfort, connection, and even innovation? How does a city's food scene reflect both its changing nature and its rich history? In a multi-hub ecosystem like Austin, could restaurants serve as the third space that brings us together? These are just a few of the questions I'll be exploring in today's episode. One that, on the surface, is all about the food and dining scene, but goes much deeper than that. My guest is Grace Chow, co-founder of Austin-based Lobos Hospitality, which has already made its mark on the city with 3 distinctive restaurants: Toasty Badger, Manny's, and the Powder Room. Grace has spent her career in hospitality development, training, and operations with the experience of over 50 concept openings in restaurant, nightlife, and hotels. She and her partners are creating concepts that are personally meaningful to them to share with the Austin communities. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Grace, welcome to Austin Next.
Thank you. How are you?
Really good and really excited because this is an episode that I've been wanting to do for almost 2 years now.
Everybody wants to talk about food.
It is, and it's such an integral part of a city, and I actually think it's an integral part of the innovation ecosystem too.
Yeah. I think it's just, it's just such like a base, like a common ground that everybody has. Everybody has like happy memories around food. Everybody has traditions around food. Everybody enjoys going out. So yeah, it's definitely something that we all share.
And I think the tough part, and I think the reason for me that it's actually taken so long to do, is finding a way to talk about it that's not like, okay, let's just talk about this one restaurant or this one trend, but the kind of the interconnectedness of all of it.
Yeah. No, that makes sense.
So starting off almost on the big aspect of it, how would you describe the Austin food scene?
That's an interesting question. Okay, so
And probably a loaded one too.
yeah, it's a totally loaded question. I actually have um, uh, so I think it depends on where you come from. I think, if you're, sort of like born in Austin, from Austin, I hear sort of like one perspective about the food scene. I think, if you're coming from certain cities, like especially like the coastal ones, like maybe like the San Franciscos or the New Yorks, the LAs, or, even Chicago's, I think that you have maybe a different perspective. And, my boyfriend's actually from a very small town in Marquette, and he thinks that the Austin food scene is just like, so I think it depends on where you're coming from. I think for me, I think that the food scene is, I would still call it burgeoning, if you will. I think that, Austin has a few things that it does just really so well. Like the barbecue is fantastic, like they have like really good microbreweries. They do some great beer, but other than that, it is a bit like American, kind of like Tex-Mex sort of focus. And I think that where maybe some other cities have moved into like very multicultural type cuisines, and they have like the talent and they have the kind of know how to do that. I think Austin is still sort of bringing these things in, so like you don't see like the big like Asian corridors, or I mean, you do have like, I think sushi is like the one thing, and Japanese food is like the one thing that's kind of like coming in. But like even, I think you've got like a Caribbean restaurant right now that's like really good, and like a few others that are kind of popping up. But I think that diversity in cuisine is still waiting to hit Austin, or still just hasn't totally infiltrated Austin.
So is that how we think about food scenes, and the quality or the scale of them is the variance, the different kinds of things coming in? Or do you think about it from okay, you said like, this is the best, and I'm sure other people listening might fight in words, but like, this is the best barbecue in the world. Like how should that we be judging that?
Yeah, I guess it's personal to each person, So, for me, for example, I think like in general, I would say that like a lot of folks, one, I think that people do like diversity. Um, you know, I think the newer, I would say like the newer generations like diversity, right? And I would say like a lot of that comes from, I'm going to call it the Food Network, has really
Right.
educated people on food, where it's like when I was growing up, I mean, nobody had heard of Gruyere, and now it's on like the Jack in the Box menu. So like people's knowledge of food is just so much deeper than it used to be, because like they have deeper understandings of different cuisines. Like I can go to the grocery store and there's harissa. Like I went to a restaurant the other day and it's like, oh yeah, shakshuka is just like so normal. So like bringing in like African cuisines or like Middle Eastern cuisines, I think they're just much more kind of known, with like food networks and people being able to access all this, and it just being like such a hobby of people. Like people really enjoy like watching food, watching chefs, watching cooking shows. Like I think that that's like very kind of fun for people, and it's sort of educated folks on like even like sort of like different cooking techniques. So I do think that that's kind of interesting for anybody that's kind of in the last 20 years, has kind of been paying attention to anything food wise. But I think there's also, there's kind of a few different ways to look at it. I mean, I think that like the quality of product is a big one. It's something that I think about quite often. I think that, you and I had connected once before, and I was sort of maybe grousing a little bit about, the farmers markets of, this place or that place, like, where produce is just so abundant because it's in a growing region where kind of like anything you put in the ground will grow versus, we're in Texas. So it's a little bit more difficult, with the climate, with what produce we're able to kind of grow locally. So I think those affect like what you can and can't do, and how fresh it is and what the seasonality is. So I think there are a lot of factors. I think for me, like the big factors in terms of like the food, the food scene, the food quality actually comes down to the culinary skill. So and I would say like that's literally like the cooks and the chefs in the kitchen. And I think that that's the one area where I'd say that like you're starting to get kind of like very interesting sort of cuisines coming to Austin. Like, and I think that we're able to procure kind of better product. Like as I see time go by, there's more demand for certain types of product. But and I think that the next one is really pushing and getting like the culinary talent to the city that maybe hasn't had like that kind of like history that some of like the other again, like to pull back to like the New Yorks or the San Franciscos, where you have just like kind of a lot of cuisines and like it's just a lot more kind of culinary knowledge. I don't totally think that that's where Austin is right now, but I do see that it's like developing, and I do see that folks, it's like some chefs are like, great chefs are like moving to town who have like this deeper kind of knowledge, to share with cooks and to start to train some of these levels. And we do have a culinary school, which is great, so that's nice and it's been around for a while, but I think that the skill level of like how you prepare whatever it is you're preparing actually is really what it comes down to.
There's a lot to unpack there that I want to dig through. So I want to start with on the product side and the ingredients. So, and this is the thing when we had talked before that it was kind of sitting with like the growing regions. Is everything have to be locally sourced? I mean, I think about their transportation networks, or is it just, and we can get, I mean, we think about like sushi all over the world, and you get that in Vegas, and it's not like Vegas is next to an ocean.
Yep.
Maybe I'm being naive here and just saying like, yeah, well, that's because of the scale. So is it just because of our scale, and as we get bigger, there are certain, we can get better access to lobster because people are going to be demanding it more, or is it there does become something special about what is local and what you can get instantaneously because it's 50 miles away?
Yeah, it's a good question. Like I don't, there's like a lot of focus on the local and the cost of transportation. I do think it's a very real thing, that we are kind of moving food all over the planet. So I think that there's a need to support local where local exists. So I would say that if it is something that exists, obviously, I mean, we all eat bananas across the U.S., but the bananas are grown, way down south. So
Right.
we've been moving things around for a while. Our kids been eating. I've been eating bananas since I was, a child, and before the food scene was really kind of pushing. But I would say that the demand for like certain types of products or quality products needs to be there in order for you to be able to, because if it's just one little restaurant that really wants, these quality, and I would say that produce is really kind of like the biggest one that I would focus on, because the shelf life on it is really very specific. But if we want certain produce, but it's only one restaurant that wants like these items, or they want a kohlrabi, or they want something that's like kind of unique, or sunflower shoots, they're not gonna bring it in if it's just Grace and Jason's restaurant down the street that's only going to use like this much of it, like
Right.
you need enough demand for it across the city to make it make sense for the suppliers to start bringing in like unique products, or to start bringing in like, higher quality products. Like if you want very specific kind of tomatoes, for instance, like the demand needs to be there in order for you to get it in. And I would say that that's where it's, where Austin, cumulatively, you know, is pushing, I think, on this demand a little bit. I was having a conversation with a chef last year, I was talking to the suppliers and how hard he was pushing them to like, bring this product in or bring that product in. And, they're kind of saying, like, well, show me the demand for it, and I'll bring it in. So I think the Austin's food scene, like I see restaurants kind of opening and popping open in like really great spots. And I see them using these products. And I think that that's very promising, because it means that like we have enough, momentum to, I don't want to use the word demand, but, to warrant somebody, going through the effort to bring these products into the city.
Well, I think demand in almost here the economic like definition sense. With when thinking about demand generation though, and you talked about like the Food Network, and now we think about like social media, what's the balance between the education and the kind of the early stage of demand generation, but then also some of these, trends can be really fleeting. And you're like, hey, I'm going to build up, a restaurant around XYZ trend. And I know you and I had some conversations about like, the molecular gastronomy movement
Mhm,
that
mhm.
I know it sounded like you really loved.
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and, and you build up these kind of concepts. And then if, 6 months later, you're like, that's not cool anymore. And I don't feel like that restaurants, correct me if I'm wrong on this, it's not like you can turn some of those things on a dime as well as others. So
Yeah.
how do you
Yeah.
kind of balance out we need all these kind of ingredients, we want to ride those trends, but you can't really the supply side is not as adaptable.
Yeah, yeah, I think you're right. I mean, there are like it is a very trendy. I mean, I think the food scene is as trendy as like the fashion scene. Like you can't wear skinny jeans anymore, apparently. But the food scene will change, and you can track those
I've never been
changes.
fashionable, so I just go with the flow.
Yeah, then we can both still wear our skinny jeans. But so like the food scene does change, like, and I think that it changes, like there are micro changes, and I think that social media, changes it even faster, because something will just kind of blow up. I get a report from a PR company that's like, hey, here are the top trendy things for fall of 2024, like, and it's like, oh yeah, the chia seeds are really in, and non-alcoholic beverages, and fill in the blank, and I've been getting this report for 20 years every single quarter, and it changes, versus before it was like, hey, they want pardon me, like half bottle cocktails, and they want deconstructed pumpkin pies, and et cetera, et cetera. And then the single
There's a
ingredient focus is a
deconstructed
big.
pumpkin pie. Isn't that just like the
It
okay,
was
go
mildly offensive. Yes, it was a blob of pumpkin, a blob of pumpkin, and like a crumble of graham crackers, and you're supposed to mix it together and put it in the whipped cream, So, and that was a big phase, So I think there are very phasey things in hospitality, and to your point, like you can't just take, especially like a brick and mortar, and sort of like shift it and completely shift it. Like it's a boat, like to sort of move. And I think my perspective on, that is really just like, honestly, try not to be so trendy. So if you follow the trends, you're just going to get lost in the trends. But if you have in your head, you have an idea of a concept, and you understand like what the heart and soul of the concept is, so one of our restaurants, for example, is like a very community kind of restaurant that we have that sort of just honestly was built, and it reminds, myself and my partners of what it was like to be 8 years old, 10 years old. We put up wall paneling from our grandma's living room, and we went and found like literally the plates, from the 70s that were,
ahead.
passed down from like my grandma to my mom. And we ate off of them, and they were hand-me-downs. And, so like there are things in this concept where like I would consider it nostalgia is like the heart of this particular concept. And the chef, we have a great chef here who can easily play with all these different ingredients. But what he'll do is he's like, hey, let's, what was my grandma, tell me what your dad used to cook for you that made you feel so good on a Sunday morning. Like, how did he make these Mickey Mouse pancakes? And he can use these ingredients, but like he's true to his concept, not true to like all the trends that are kind of like pushing around.
I mean, there's a reason, not to spoil the movie for everybody, but it's been out for a while. But there's a reason why the climax of Ratatouille is about a nostalgia dish, right?
Yes, yes, like it's exactly what it's about. It's interesting, like even in in hospitality, like a lot of times, like one of the things that you'll hear people do is like they like to connect via food and sort of talk about like how ubiquitous it is and how we all have like these different emotional connections to it. And you can take, like in the Ratatouille when he was like taking the bite of this one, and it was like, oh, it took him back. And that I mean is there's truth to that. Like it's what the scent of like a certain, of a certain pie will do for you when you walk into the room, or like the way that you taste like your mom's, the one thing that that your auntie used to make you for Thanksgiving, or fill in the blank, like it takes you back. And like there's so much strong emotion that's attached to it, so it's like, I think when you're kind of creating these, concepts, there are a lot of different like ways to kind of go about it, a lot of different concepts that you can kind of attach. But like if you can create a whole concept that's just whole in terms of like, hey, everything that we do is true to this, kind of story that we're telling, or true to this kind of experience we want to create for you, you're just not so beholden to kind of like, the trends that come and go, where it's like, I need to have the 4-layer quesadilla, like it's so hot right now. Like, you don't have to worry so much about what's on Instagram or what's going to kind of like just take off, via social media, because you can just do what you believe, is great. And that, some people will enjoy. And the truth of it is that food is very subjective, so it doesn't matter what you do. Some people will love it, and like a couple people will not like it so much, so you just have to kind of like stay your course and really believe like, hey, like this is, this is a whole true story.
And of course, this is much easier said than done. The people who are truly successful in any of these are the ones who actually are the originators of the trends.
The ones who are originators of trends, yeah, I think, yeah. By the time
That's easy to say, and then of course, to actually do is a whole different thing.
yeah, exactly. What they call them, like second adopters, third adopters. Yeah, that's true.
Well, and it is a lot of it's mixing, and I mean, we talk about like having, does anybody truly have an original thought, or is it like I take a little of A, B, C, put them together, think about building off of, you said, building off nostalgia, being in a new place, putting these things, influencing from what you're around, what your history is, and then
Mm-hmm.
seeing, putting that the old phrase, putting the melting pot together and seeing what comes out.
Yep, exactly. I mean, there. I feel like there's, especially like folks like to, kind of think about like the innovation and like, but I think like innovation in terms of food scene is, in the last 20 years or so, like the big innovation is that people are just so much more familiar with all these ingredients, and they can kind of mix them into like the new world, where you can hop onto a menu and you're like, yeah, this is, you know, broccoli with kimchi, and then I've got my cheeseburger with sauerkraut, and like just kind of like mixing things in a way. I think that that's where I think that everybody's just been like putting it all into the pot and just mixing it together, and like that's been kind of interesting. But they're not, it's not like the thing where it's like, hey, like I'm on the the cutting edge of fill in the blank. I think that it's more about I'm in the quality level.
So how do you think about then being as like an Austin restaurant and being here and bringing the innovation that you want to bring while bringing kind of being open to the influence of what's here, or maybe not being like, okay, we're being here and being in kind of an innovative city, but we're going to just kind of do our thing. How do you kind of balance that out?
Yeah, I think you have to understand, the climate that you're in. I think it's really important, and one of the things that we really first understood about Austin is that Austin is approachable, not slick is like how I would describe Austin. It's not a slick city. It's not like a showy kind of a flashy, like it is very, and probably the reason that my partners and I were kind of drawn to it in the first place, like it does have a very homey feel to it, like a very kind of neighborhood, very community feel to it. And, I think developing concepts that fit within that is very important. It's like, we're not going to take, something I think that would fit into the middle of, any other city and sort of do it here. Like everything like that you create has to be created with, the community that you're serving in mind. So I think that that's something that's where the concepts that we're putting out, like, we are kind of thoughtful about like, hey, like folks in Austin, which we kind of like the same things, but yeah, well, we really enjoy like concepts that are somewhat approachable, where it feels like very friendly, where it feels, like kind of like a very human touch sort of thing. It's like we don't have like, the big tech, fill in the blank where you walk in and, kind of like you're not greeted, or it's just like so unapproachable that you feel like a little bit, like I need to like, who am I dressed well enough? So, like it's got to feel, there has to be like a comfort level to it.
But at the same time, I think and I think this is good to walk through, like, Toasty Badger, Manning's, and Powder Room, because, I've been to them all, and they're very different. So
Yeah.
all have a very different vibe in while things. So like, I'd love to kind of walk through each and talk about like how you're thinking about them, and the fact that they're also very different time of day, for lack of a better, I don't know what the right term is, but when you show up to them and how they fit into the scheme.
Yeah, they are very different. And I think, yeah, I think that, for us, like one of the things that we were very interested in doing is really working on concepts and projects that we personally think are interesting, that we have some sort of like a creative connection to, and to tie it kind of back to like, telling whole stories, like the Toasty Badger is like probably the opposite of the powder room, they're very, very
To say the
different.
least, yes.
Yeah, they're very, very different. I don't know that everybody's
Took
gonna
my
walk.
kids to one, did not take my kids to the
They're not
other.
taking kids together. Yeah, I don't know totally know that people walk in and be like, oh yeah, these are done by the same folks that did, like, oh, I can see, and I think that like, I think that in some cases, like you really can sort of tell those through lines. Like you can walk in a certain, like I can walk into certain restaurants and be like, this is a fill in the blank chef restaurant because like
Hmm.
it's a very signature feel to it. And a lot of the things like feel very similar, which I actually might enjoy, like, oh, I love all their concepts, but I think for us, like, it was really about like creating, we were actually making the powder room. We were in the middle of making the powder room, which is, it's a cocktail lounge. Obvious, it's open in the evening. We're open late, like we love a music vibe, like we love a great cocktail, like, so it just has like a very different energy. Like obviously, like, you're not going to take your kids. And then the Toasty Badger is
I got
very,
crazy kids, but I still don't
yeah, maybe the 10-year-old.
know.
And the Toasty Badger is very different, right? Like we tend to pop off in the morning and the afternoon. Like it's a very like lunch spot. Like it's, like a different crowd comes into the space. But, like the thing for us is, I think that one, like, so like I personally have had the opportunity to work in a lot of different hospitality concepts, which is, kind of, I think it really informed the way that I think about the industry and the business of it. And my partners have as well. But like, even if you're thinking about it from a consumer standpoint, like from a consumer standpoint, I would love to go to the Toasty Badger, and then I love to hop across the street. Like I'll go to Vinaigrette, which is a salad place, and then like I'll go down the spot to like, local sushi, and then like I'll go to. So like even as a consumer, we love to take in all these different types of concepts. Like we really enjoy it, and I think that as a creator, you also sometimes like really enjoy that diversity and sort of like you're telling different stories, if you will. Like what we enjoy about Powder Room and the story that we're telling with Powder Room is different than the story that we're telling about Manny's or Toasty Badger. And I think that the thing about hospitality is that there's so much, like we have 3 or 4 other concepts that are like, in our head or on the horizon that are really different from these ones. But, for us, it's really about creating things that we think are interesting to tell like as a story versus, kind of creating like, we're not creating like one thing and then just sort of like duplicating it again and again. And I'm not saying that's, nothing against that. I think that's actually really smart and super fantastic. But we want to create like interesting concepts that we think can tell sort of the unique stories and create like different experiences that we can resonate to. And I can resonate to being like a patron at the Powder Room, and I can resonate with coming in and like grabbing my coffee at Toasty Badger, and like how it feels to feel like at the neighborhood counter versus how it feels to feel like, hey, like I'm out. It's a Saturday night, and like I'm out with my girlfriends. Like so I think that being able to tell those stories and being able to resonate with them personally like helps to create them.
Do they fit in from a like the big? So we all moved here, 4 years ago, and the comment everybody's made, one of the biggest changes is reservations. Like
Yeah,
it's a lot harder to get in places. The joke. This was a few months ago. We went out with a couple friends of ours, and it was literally like we wanted 7 o'clock reservations. We just went down our list. We got
yeah,
two, and then text them and said, "You pick."
yeah.
And that's kind of been the big change. But so, I mean, is your sense it is really competitive now? Is it when comparing it to a New York and San Francisco, it's like, oh no, it's you haven't seen Cutthroat. I mean, what's kind of the vibe of kind of the restaurant versus restaurant, if that's even the right way to put it?
Yeah, I would say it's kind of like we're getting kind of a mix, and I would say that like the restaurant versus restaurant, um, the like kind of internal like relationships between restaurant, I would say like in some ways mirrors like the overall Austin relationships, where you have some folks who are like wow, cool, love like new concepts, love this, love that, let's try it, and there are other folks who are like, whoa, 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 don't change my Austin, like I'm kind of against it. We experience the same thing, like from I think a consumer standpoint, and from like we have some restaurants that are like, my God, welcome to town, like several restaurants came out and supported us on our opening day at Toasty Badger, and they were like, hey, just want to say, welcome, like excited to have you here, like people that would be considered, if you will, direct competitors. But and other folks are just very like, I don't know, like, you know, and a little bit like apprehensive. But I would say that, my perspective on it is that, and I'm somewhat aware of like other, I know other groups coming to town, other chefs and like other folks. Our perspective, the more momentum you have, the better it is for everybody. It's hard to be, like
100%.
the one, the two, the three, the four, the five great restaurants in a town, where it's like, okay, but if you're the five great restaurants in a town, you're at the same, you're at this level where there's not enough, aren't enough restaurants to attract amazing culinary talent to the city, which is what we all need to survive, and to thrive. There aren't enough restaurants, like we talked about, to warrant bringing like certain products into the city. There isn't enough of like a scene of restaurants to develop that culture of like people like really getting into food and following the different restaurants and caring so much about like who's around, which I think people want to do that. Like they want to be on, Eater Austin and figuring out like who's opening and who's doing this and like which big events coming up, like, and for us to have food festivals and for us to have like, different like cocktail gatherings. So you need momentum in order for it to be this hospitality kind of a scene. The more the better, So I would say that Austin is, in my mind, still a bit shy of, the number of restaurants and the types of concepts and the number of people that are kind of like participating, like the number of different groups that are, I think a really healthy city has just a lot of different groups that are participating, So, whereas Austin has, 10, 12, maybe kind of like, I would say hospitality groups who have like multiple venues. And I think that that's just really, really healthy. So I think the more people that are opening things and creating things, and starting things in Austin, the better the whole scene becomes. And that's actually really healthy for everybody.
What do you think about the kind of the next layer out, like the food media, the both in Austin and outside, covering the social people, like, is that at a healthy point? Is there not a lot of it? Is it, how are we getting kind of the connections between?
I feel like there's pretty good media. I feel like they really need content.
Okay.
So like, I think they would also love to have a lot more, like a lot more concepts. Like, you're kind of mentioning the reservations thing where it's like, hey, like you pull up, it's Friday night. If you don't have a reservation and it's 7 o'clock on a Friday night, on July 24th of 2024, yeah, you're going to pull up. And and it was somewhat of a phenomenon when I came here. Somebody was telling me that that people did this. And I was like, no way. You pull up your open table and you just kind of scroll down to see like what's open and what still has something available versus, if I'm in, Miami, I'm going to think about where I want to go. And then I go to the restaurant and then I make a reservation. Maybe I'm coming in a little later than I wanted, a little earlier, but it's not like wholly like, hey, like restaurants are just like wholly booked out. Like, the majority of restaurants are just wholly booked out across the city. With the exception of like certain kind of like large conventions that come to town. So there's still so much more demand, I think, than there is supply, for restaurants, specifically on weekends, in Austin. I think it's, my perception is, hey, like you have like all the businesses that, kind of come in, the businesses support that growth, which is fantastic. And then I remember that there was like the big concern about a housing shortage,
Mhm.
a few years ago when I was moving here. I was like, oh, there's just not enough housing to support. Like we really need to build more housing. Then the housing is getting built. And I feel like the hospitality is kind of like, hospitality kind of like follows some of these ones where it's like, okay, like now there's like, we want things to do. So, hospitality kind of follows that wave behind it. So I do see that changing in the next few years. And I do know that so many folks are building things in town and we meet folks all the time who are just like, I'm creating this concept or I'm building this one or, so like, I know that growth is happening for sure. And that I believe that will level out in the next few years as well.
What about intersections with kind of other, I'd say, adjacencies like the CPG scene? Excuse me, the CPG scene. You've got like the Tito's, or like the larger stuff, or the smaller, or even when we talk about like the live music capital of the world, and we see a lot of kind of the art scene. How are you seeing the kind of the restaurant scene intersecting with those?
You know what? I guess I would say that I wish I would see it intersecting more.
Hmm.
I don't know that I see a lot of like interaction um, compared to other cities where there's just like such like deep ties. And I feel like it's because so much of it is new. Like you have so many like newer restaurants that have been open for 5, 6, 7 years. So 3, 4 years. And I think you have like a lot of like new. I have distilleries that reach out to me pretty regularly and like, hey, I just started. We've been around for about 2 years. I just started this. Here's our story and this is what we're about. So I see like that kind of like networking kind of starting to happen, I think, amongst like these different, kind of groups or industries. But you don't see like kind of like deeply bred, like, hey, like these are programs that we put in place, like these are festivals we put in place, like these are different ways that we like partner up on, activations. I feel like that's not as strong now as it will be in a few years. I think that like all the players are there and all the parties are there, and it's just like that natural next step of getting to okay, cool, like what are the cool things we can do together.
Do you think it requires 1,000 small actions, or do you think it requires a few, biggies to step up and create things?
God, I don't know. I would say that that's a really good question. I think that when it comes to like, kind of things with like the arts or the music scene, I feel like bigger activations really have such great response. I feel like when you're dealing, it's kind of like smaller things where you have, a new gin, for example, that kind of comes out. I think that small activations can be really awesome and kind of partner up on those ones. But I guess I would say like, I'm not sure what it takes, but I would say that I would love to see a large art activation or a large, music activation or something, that's kind of like festivally that really ties in to that food scene. And there are some things that are happening. There's a gal that invited me to one a couple of years ago, and I think she's putting it on for her third year now, where she pairs up a lot of like local restaurants in town, and she pairs them up with like local farms. Which is
Mhm.
interesting. And I want to say that I went to her first year probably, and it felt like maybe there were like 20, 25, different booths and restaurants kind of participating. I'm sure it's grown since then, but things like that, like I think that become very interesting where people can go like really participate, and that like the food really is the front focus. I think that those are really interesting. And like, just personally, I would love to see more, art activation.
Let's see. Lobos going to do any of these? Come on, you guys. There's only so much you can point to others. We got to step up and be like, okay, I guess we got to do it.
I know, right? I know. I
With all
maybe
the free
change the
time you
world.
guys have.
I know. We shot around and we're like, we should do a festival. And I was like, okay, hold on. Let's just use one or two things first. So
Um, a lot of times we kind of want to think about innovation and on all these different kind of verticals. So we talked about the trends and kind of they come and they go, but where is innovation happening in like the restaurant and the food scene? Is it like just the recipes and ingredients themselves, or is it the way that restaurants themselves are being run?
I think that like there's something about the way that restaurants are being run and participating in the bigger um, social, economic, political climate than maybe, it has been in the past. I think where there's like a lot of perspectives in terms of like, hey, this is what we support. This is what we're really not behind, like,
Mm.
I think participating in conversations about, sort of belief systems, I think is really big that restaurant groups and restaurateurs, are being very involved. And I think that that's kind of like an innovative change. I would say that like the way that restaurants are run, like it's very interesting. Like restaurants are, they've been made very economically efficient by the way that just as a function of the market, so like, there are specific
Margins
models
aren't huge in the restaurant business.
margins aren't huge. Yeah, margins aren't huge. Like it's a lot of work. There are a lot of moving parts, so and it's just really been made efficient by just, I mean, there's just, so many people in the restaurant industry that are figuring this out, and it becomes, the competitiveness in it, becomes that, okay, well, if I'm operating one restaurant and you're operating one restaurant and we're operating the same hamburger stand, what is the differentiating factor between, our two hamburger stands or the 17 hamburger stands that, exist? We're all making hamburgers, so like you can play a little bit with, the different factors. You can play a little bit with the branding. You can play a little bit with, the product that you're using. Like consistency is a big driver, and consistency, I think, is probably just such a key driver, and that comes down to people and training and processes, that it ends up being that a time investment is really the biggest differentiator, I think, between like a lot of restaurants and how they function is how much time you're putting into it and how much attention and focus you're putting onto it. And so it becomes like a little bit tricky in that world. I think that a lot of like innovation that happens is where people are saving. I would say that like something I think is innovative that has come out in the last, I'll call it like the last 10 years or so, toast. You know, like it's a point of sale system where,
Hmm.
the operators are bringing in the revenue, and it manages their functions. And when I started in the industry, it was just like this just grouse between like everybody just being like, please somebody figure out how to integrate. And at the time, like you were specifically onboarding like different people, see to it that was like, oh yeah, this is going to integrate your payroll to your point of sale system, your point of sale system to your inventory system, and your point of sale system to your reservation system. And you had 16 different integrations, and it was like really wild and crazy, and everything was down half the time. It took so much time. And now you have technology, and I'll say that Toast has done, like, I think, a really good job for restaurateurs of, cool, now it's all integrated, so like I can, my team can clock in, and then their payroll is on the same system that their sales are, which means that their tips come out of the same system. Like, you don't have like a manager like it used to be that you would do your like everything on an Excel spreadsheet, so like you do your inventory on an Excel spreadsheet, and you can figure out. And now, there's software that will just tell you like, hey, did you know that the cucumbers are up 12% from the cost that they were last week? And you're like, oh, okay. Versus like having to sort of like manually do these things. So I think that there have been a lot of like innovative technology things that have happened that have made things, like just so much easier and so much simpler for people to operate in restaurants. I would say that there's like diversity in like reservations platforms. For example, I remember OpenTable was like the gorilla, like the big
Hmm.
dog, and that was really the only platform out there. And everybody, you couldn't even switch away from OpenTable, and it was just so hesitant. And like, oh, if we leave OpenTable, even though they're charging rates that I don't think work for my business model, we'll never get a reservation, because like it's just that's what everybody uses. And now it's like, well, now there's 7 or 8 different platforms, and people will find you, if they're looking for a reservation. And it's just kind of a different world. So I would say that like some of the ways that tech has kind of played into it have really changed. Even like maybe it's just not like kind of at the forefront of like the consumer necessarily. You're not seeing those ones because you're not seeing kind of like the back end systems. Like that's been a big change. Everybody has a KDS kitchen display screen system, which helps you time up your orders like just so accurately, so that they're all coming out in just a better quality, and you're not firing things ahead of schedule. And like you can just, your third parties, instead of having 16 different iPads with all of your third party delivery apps, like it all just flows right to the kitchen. So there's just so much tech change that's happened, in the last decade, that's just astonishing for the business.
I'm glad we're doing this remotely because I'm kind of afraid to ask this question. Is there a role for like robotics and automation?
I hope so. Like every time that somebody shows me, it's funny. Every time there's like a burger flipping robot that I love, like this it was like little YouTube video of the robot. And and I hear murmurings, of people working on different things that are like kind of like robotic. And I think where you'll see them do it in sort of like in the vending machine style, where it's like, oh yeah, like now I can have this vending machine that, will do this one thing, or it'll, like, okay, I can make a vending machine coffee now, or I can make it's not a vending machine cupcake, but you have the cupcake ATM, I heard that somebody's working on like this whole kind of like robotics that will put together, certain meals for you. But, the tricky thing is like that's just not totally there yet. And I don't know. I guess I'm just a believer. Like I don't totally know when it's going to come about or how it's going to come about. We haven't solved it yet, but
But
I
where do
do
you
think that.
see, whenever I see the pitch for it, it tends to be on faster lower end, right? It's
Yep.
the real efficiency play. And
Yeah.
so when you start moving into the higher end, assuming let's assume a way that it works. So it works, it's what you want. Where do you see it fitting into the kind of the higher end restaurants?
It's difficult for me to imagine it right now where it fits in the higher end restaurants, and I'd love to believe that there is something there, just because so many things and are able to be automated now. Like I just feel like, okay, like there's got to be some opportunity here. Right now where they have it is like robot delivery, where it's the robot will deliver the food to your table, where it's,
Mm.
and you're kind of like, okay, well, in a high end restaurant that's a little bit tricky because you're losing this like personal touch, which is really what we want. So then it's like, okay, well, is there some sort of like outside of the consumer eye, they have mixology machines now where it's like, they can mix up any sort of cocktail that you want. And you can put all your cocktails, on draft, and they're perfectly mixed. It's like there's like small like little opportunities like that. But like the big opportunity I think that a lot of people are looking for with the food is really what I would call like the cook line. Is there opportunity to put like robotics on the cook line? And I would say like right now it's quite complicated, just because like there are so many different ingredients and there are so many different modifications, and everybody has like their own sort of like special preferences now that didn't totally exist, a long time ago. And like the cooking techniques, there's I feel like that is a beast that I would love to see somebody tackle. I don't know exactly how it would be done or how to do it, but um, that I think would be like one of the bigger challenges to sort of automate would be like the cook line. But some of these like little functions on the front end, I see people, like you can put yourself on your own wait list now. You can do your own table side order. I go to like a restaurant that like they'll have that little thing like order your own food, and close out your own check, So I think they figured out some of these things in like casual, to your point, casual or even like mid-range restaurants. But like the cooking itself is still like, I think a bit of a reach.
Do you see something of the high, something like maybe Powder Room or Manny's or even Toasty Badger, where I think that one of Austin's, I think, strength is going to be this intersection of the digital and the physical. So I think obviously robotics is a major, we're seeing that whether it's kind of the Tesla Optimus or Icon or any of these kind of the guys. I mean, would you guys be open to, I don't know, putting you on the spot, trying out these things as people? I see these kind of technologies Austin being a perfect fit for someone kind of building the next, cooking robot.
Yeah, I think that I think that for me, I would have to see it and understand how it worked. And if I was a believer, then yes, we would try it. So, and if somebody came up and was like, "Hey, Grace, here's a cooking robot that can make, this dish perfectly and can handle the modifications," I'd be like, "Whoa, sign me up." It's probably more consistent, than a human. Like humans, like we're all fallible. Like we get overwhelmed. If I get overwhelmed on a station, I'm like, okay, I just burnt my bacon, because I
Right.
was looking at the pancakes, and I'm human, like, so put another bacon down, So, I mean, in the same way that I think that technology is just so much more consistent than human, like I would love to see how that comes into play. And if there was something like, yeah, if I was a believer in the product and was like, yeah, this seems to me like it would work, and it seems like a consistent quality product, I would do it.
Kind of another angle on the kind of connection between the kind of tech innovation scene and like restaurants we've seen throughout history, whether it be, the coffee shops in Silicon Valley to the salons in the 1920s, this idea of the third place being the creative center, the kind of creative collisions. I've heard of that in Austin, like previously there was the old kind of like everybody was at the Four Seasons kind of back in the day, but I don't think that's happening anymore. Do you see that the restaurant scene being a place for that possibly being in Austin? And I think one of the big reasons that I kind of bring this up, especially now, is we're we're transforming into a multi-hub region, and I think it's a good thing, right? Because you have like Cedar Park and the building rockets out there to all the way out in Bastrop to downtown. So while we're physically separating because of the nature of what we're building, uh, so you kind of need some of that connectivity to come together physically. And I think a thriving restaurant scene might be one of those places where it kind of cuts across everybody.
Yeah, I could see that. I think that well, I think that's Reddit now, but I think I think if you have a restaurant scene, like it has to be just like the right kind of restaurant scene where it's a little more, like a smaller restaurant that's just kind of like a full service restaurant. You can't kind of like camp out in the way that I think
Hmm.
you would need to sort of like camp out as a consumer. So it sort of seems like something that would need to be like a little more like to your point, like a coffee shop, like a little casual, like have enough space for people kind of like hang out. And I feel like there would have to be some sort of like I feel like there would have to be some sort of good catalyst. It's interesting because I think, when I think back, and I obviously wasn't alive in the 20s, but when I think back, to how people sort of interacted, okay, the 80s I can remember. I'll talk about the 80s, but how you interacted before technology, I think that you almost have to work to overcome technology in some ways to get people together to talk and to have, these interactions, because I feel like a lot of folks you know, I feel like a lot of folks don't interact the same way that you would, you know, um, that you would without technology. Like there's a coffee shop that I used to, go to in a previous town where actually there was like a small intellectual group of folks. It was four folks. They were between their 70s and 80s, and they got together every Sunday just to, they'd read the newspaper and they would just chit chat about kind of like whatever was going on. And it was very interesting to me, because I actually felt like it was a bit foreign. Like I haven't, and I work in restaurants and coffee shops, and I've been in the industry forever. And it's very actually quite uncommon for me to see things where it's like just folks purely getting together for intellectual conversation on a
Everyone's
regular
got their head in the computer or their head in the phone now.
Exactly, exactly. Like they'll have like a meetup, where it's like, okay, there's this one meetup where we're gonna get together and it's not well attended, or it's a little bit awkward, or people don't. And it was interesting, like these folks, maybe it was a generational difference, but they were very free with their opinions, that were very contrasting, like very open with opposition, just in a way that it was very, I think kind of welcome to have just a variety of opinions, where today I feel like like if somebody's kind of out there with this kind of controversial opinion, like it becomes like very heated very fast, where it's less supported to have just kind of like different ideas. And I feel like I would love to see something where there was like a great like creative hub, or like an intellectual hub. And I do think that restaurants, especially coffee shops and kind of like casual spots, they would be like they're I think like they're technically like a good place for this to happen. Like this is a very social environment, but like you almost have trouble getting people to socialize in general,
Hmm.
like that, so a lot of folks, they don't chat up, the person next to them. Like there's a lot of stranger danger, and and
Which
anything
would
that's like
then layer on top the whole loneliness epidemic that we're talking about, because there's no, there's no the organizations that people used to belong to, whether it be the church or the Rotary Club or any of these things, kind of fell off, and then so there's just this lack of connection. And yeah, I'm bad in terms of like using X and all these kind of social media and doing it, but like it's you know you need to form connections in other ways.
Yeah, you need to form connections in other ways. And I this is my perception, but I think that people are just so much busier than we used to be. It's like, okay, well now you have like everybody in the household is working, and you have two jobs, and you have kids, and then you have all your outside commitments, and then you're supposed to have like kind of this like leisurely time. But I feel like, is everybody working 80 hours a week? So it kind of like is a little bit of a different world. So I think that if there is going to be this kind of like creative social environment, like it needs to be very intentional. I think in some ways, you have like some of these private clubs, that have tried to do that, and it just maybe hasn't totally taken off, or it doesn't necessarily hit. Like I think that if it is going to be something where it's like, hey, there's this, this is this place that we're creating that is meant to be, innovative, creative, like an idea hub. I think that one, I mean, it has to be very, very intentional, and there has to be commitment from people to kind of like regularly show up and regularly contribute, to being part of that network and part of that community.
Yeah, and talk. You said, and talk to the person next to you.
And talk to the person next to you. Yeah. Yeah. It's really, I mean, it's huge. Like the restaurant that we have a very small restaurant, Toasty Badger, but that one, it was very inspired by like, you know, the Cafe Nervosas of, Frasier, and, the Central Perk of Friends, and the Lukes of Gilmore, so of this idea, that maybe is or is not ever a reality, but it's the idea where,
I was just going to say, it's an interesting thing. You referenced cultural like touch points that don't exist.
exactly, exactly, like this idea that like that doesn't that's it's maybe it's like something that never really existed, um, or maybe it did exist, in some ways, like like I mean I
Which is funny, is I mentioned like the 1920s saloons or salons. Saloons are very different, and because I had somebody on who wrote a book called Centers of Progress: 40 Cities That Changed the World, and they had Paris in there, but it was Paris 1600s. And what
oh
was interesting is if you change the names, it read like Paris in the 1920s, because it was still very much the cafe culture. It was just a very, so that was still very much in the heart of Paris. It was, they obviously the dress was a little bit different. The topics in the Enlightenment age were very different than the, avant-garde of Picasso and Hemingway. But it was just interesting that state was still there 300 years later.
yeah.
So, and And the part that's interesting is that if we're to do something like that in Austin, you also have to keep it. And that's where the saloon part comes in instead of salon. Is it has to feel like Austin and
Yeah.
not like a fake representation of we're gonna, you want to take the vibe and the thing that resonates with us from those periods and the idea, but not try to. I always make this feeling. I hate the term Silicon Hills. This is us trying to kind of copy, but there are things you can learn from Silicon Valley. There are things you can learn from Paris. There are things you can learn from New York.
Mm-hmm.
But to be, have the food scene be an Austin food scene that takes the best of other places in terms of what you learn from it, but be uniquely us.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think if you could create, this cafe culture, that I'm also like very drawn to, I think is really interesting. I don't think the other cities can do that or have done that, like I haven't experienced those ones living in, some of the other larger cities. Like, I think that Austin does probably have more of a shot of developing this cafe culture than any of those cities because of, I think we've discussed this before, just because of how Austin kind of is right now and how it's formed. And, a lot of folks have kind of moved from other places. People are very open to new connections. People are very open to being social, I think, in a way that, perhaps they aren't necessarily, if you just kind of like lived in the same place, you've grown up in the same place, like you have your network of people, like you're set and you're good. I feel like Austin probably has the best chance of any of these cities of developing this like really cool kind of like cafe culture of intermixing ideas. Like, folks that tend to come to Austin, I think tend to be, very creative, or they're ideators or the creators or they're founders. Like it sort of seems to like naturally draw, certain personality types. So I think that if that could exist, like the city has like the best shot at it.
Yeah, and they're all, and that list that you read was, I think, the best point. It's not all tech. It's not all writers. It's not all musicians. It's this weird eclectic mix of wonderful different things, and you kind of get them all in a room, and who the hell knows what's going to come out of that.
Yeah, I would love to see it happen. We should think about this. We should think on this.
Grace, this has been great, and I'm now hungry again after every time I talk to you. I always like to end with the same question: what's next, Austin?
That's a good question. Maybe it's cafe culture. Could be. I feel like I don't know. I feel like it's culinary, just culinary world appreciation for, participation in, enjoyment of. I think just everybody kind of becoming a little bit nerdier about food and a little bit nerdy about restaurants. But I think that's the direction that it's naturally heading.
Perfect. Everyone, get out there and eat.
Yes.
Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for talking.
So what's next, Austin? We're glad you've joined us on this journey. Please subscribe at your favorite podcast catcher, leave us a review, and let your colleagues know about us. This will help us grow the podcast and continue bringing you unique interviews and insights. Thanks again for listening, and see you soon.